We now will look at a very important variation of the sniper, the 4 Dake C5 pawn grab. And there's a number of ways you can get there. Let's look at e4, g6, d4, bishop g7, knight f3, c5, and now of course knight c3, queen a5 was our heretical, or knight c3, c takes d4 can lead to a regular accelerated dragon or a regular dragon. But we're now going to look at d takes c5. Note that d5 will be covered in the Sniper Benoni section. There we will look at an excellent game from Topalov, among others. But after c5, d takes c5, and surprisingly enough, a number of players have preferred to play this position with black as opposed to an early c takes d4 themselves. So of course, there's only one way to fly here. We need to play queen a5 check and recoup our pawn. Now of course, knight to c3, we can then again highly recommend the sniper investment with bishop c3, bc3, queen takes c3 check, bishop d2, and queen takes c5. And if you remember, we very much like the setup used by Boris Chadal-Balshev, where he went d6, knight f6, knight bd7, queen c7, b6, bishop b7, and sometimes he would play e5. Once the black knight reaches c5 in those positions, black's position is like a rock. So, after queen a5 check, the most usual, of course, is c3. And now, queen takes c5. Now, of course, the black queen is developed early, which can be a negative, as she can be harassed by some of the white minor pieces. For example, the bishop coming to e3, the pawn coming to b4. However, white has also traded a d-pawn, which we said was worth $1, versus a c-pawn, which Lev Albert says is worth about 80 to 85 cents. So, if white is unable to develop an early initiative, what we find time and time again as we look at these master and grandmaster games is that the initiative slowly, gradually, sometimes almost imperceptibly shifts in black's favor. So let's take a look. Queen c5, bishop e3, far and away white's most popular choice. Among the practitioners, grandmasters Victor Korchnoi and John Nunn. But even so, in the Chess Mega Database 2010, the immediate bishop attack on the queen, in 372 games, white only scored 48%. Definitely a subpar performance for white. Next, after queen a5, is knight a3. Knight on the edge of the board, a bit more subtle approach. And this is also a dangerous try for the initiative. In fact, as Grandmaster Sveshnikov explains in a very similar position on the white side of the c3 Sicilian, the black queen on c5 is not particularly well placed and can be always attacked at a later date. Practice tends to support his claim, as in 181 games in the same mega database, white scored an impressive 63.5%. Among the leading practitioners of knight to a3 are Grandmasters Kazhmidinov, Nakamura, and Malikov. Therefore, sniper players need to be very especially aware of the dangers involved when white plays knight a3. Let's see what else we have. Well, there's also the non-challenging bishop d3. Here, white doesn't really look to particularly develop an aggressive early queenside initiative, and therefore it's not surprising that this approach is not all that effective and was only seen in 27 games for an extremely subpar performance of 27% for white. So let's take a look. Queen c5, bishop e3, and now queen a5 is one interesting possibility. There we will look at the interesting game Thorburn-Elvest versus Grandmaster Ron W from Iceland 2004, which black scored an early knockout in 20 moves. Now, queen a5, 7 bishop to c4 supposedly is a continuation that casts doubt on queen a5, and everyone there quotes the games Haslinger-Turner from England 2007, which white won in 37 moves. After queen a5, there's also bishop d4. This, of course, is one of white's key ideas is to try and oppose our sniper bishop. Here we will see one example from the European Women's Tournament, Svetlana Gapininko, where the opening worked out very well for black. After queen a5, there's also knight at b to d2. The knight can either come to b3 or to c4 to harass the black queen. In Bednarek versus Grandmaster Nitov from Poland in 2008, this non-aggressive approach led to a total disaster for white. So what else do we have? After queen c5, bishop e3, of course the most popular retreat is to play queen back to c7. After queen c7, black's idea is pretty simple. He wants to continue with b6, sometimes queen b7, d6, bishop d7, knight c6, knight f6, and go about his business. As the game progresses, the extra center pawn will help him ward off any white initiative. This setup led to a beautiful win for black in the game Adam Rodney versus Joseph Horvath from Hungary 2007. A quick, beautiful crush in 26 moves. We definitely will take a look at that game. Going back, after queen c5, bishop e3, queen c7, again, there's always the plan of bishop to d4, opposing sniper bishops. In practice, this plan has proved somewhat awkward. It's a bit slow for white and has led to several nice wins for the sniper. So a number of different games here to take a look at. And all in all, this plan of bishop to d4, while it seems logical to the white players, you can simply block with knight f6, attack that bishop at a later date with knight c6, or you can throw up e5 and then go ahead and play that position. Either way, it's a bit slow, it's a bit cumbersome, and the pawn on c3 kind of is double-edged. After queen takes c5, bishop e3, queen c7, there's also the slower h3. A bit of a positional move, looks to take away the g4 square from either the knight coming from f6 to g4 or the bishop. But all in all, my belief is it's a touch slow and a touch premature. And here it's important to note, knight to c6 is probably not the most accurate, probably better to play d6. Hold up the white e-pawn. After queen c5, bishop e3, queen c7, there's also the aggressive combination of knight a3. This is very dangerous, and if your opponent plays like this, you need to be on extra alert. The point is that the knight coming to b5 puts pressure on the a7 and c7 squares. And if you try to play a6, you then lose almost instantly to knight c4, and the weakness of b6 is exploited. After queen c5, bishop e3, queen c7, again, there's knight bd2. Not particularly threatening approach. Also in the same vein, queen c5, bishop d3 is not particularly aggressive. And we'll just look at the first move of a couple of games where black did okay there. After queen takes c5, the most challenging is knight a3. This move was even awarded an exclamation point by Evgeny Sveshnikov in his C3 Sicilian work, and I have to say that I cannot disagree. White's plan here is to simply develop a blitzkrieg-style attack with a lethal combination of knight to b5 and bishop to e3 thrown in, sometimes queen a4, sometimes e5. Black has to really be on extra high alert. This is one of the times when you have to have a very precise move order in mind. So after queen c5, knight a3, the first thing that we will examine is the little petite combination bishop c3, queen takes c3, and why this is not good for black. First off, white should simply play queen d2, which we will take a look at. Bishop d2, queen a3 is less precise, although bishop d2 was played by Kazhminov in a game against Vandenberg, which he did win in 31 moves. However, queen d2 is probably pretty much the refutation to black's opening play. So, while you might want to play bishop takes c3 in a blitz game, but then again, why bother? If we know it's bad, play something good. After bc3, queen d2, okay, queen c5, knight a3, d6 was actually used by Grandmaster Wojciech in 2004 to get a very good game with black against the American superstar Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura. But a year later, Hikaru improved on his earlier play with knight b5, a6, and then bishop e3. After queen c6, the simple but powerful knight a7. And after queen c7, Hikaru simply collected the bishop pair and played queen b3, with a huge advantage and went on to win in 49 moves. So after queen c5, knight a3, we're not going to play d6, and b6 is also a bit slow because bishop e3, queen c6, and now the very powerful bishop to c4, with the brutal, crude, straightforward threat of simply bishop to d5. After queen b7, for example, white builds the initiative with queen b3, hitting the f7 pawn. And of course, e6, then knight b5 with a crushing initiative for white. This is exactly the kind of blitzkrieg attack that black has to avoid in the early stages of the opening. And again, as we said, if he's able to avoid this type of blitzkrieg attack, in the long term, black has excellent prospects. So let's go back. After queen c6, knight a3, the most challenging and most dynamic is to counterattack the white e-pawn with knight f6. And this is very much in keeping in the spirit of the sniper. In addition to attacking and provoking the white pawn, black also prepares for quick castling to secure his king. So after knight f6, knight b5 is probably considered white's sharpest, and there we have b6, recommended by Charlie Story in his book on the sniper, published in 2011. After knight f6, knight a3, knight f6. After b6, there's also the very interesting b4. And this was first played by the Hungarian international master, very serious player, Grosspeter. Played on some Hungarian student teams back in the late 70s, early 80s. And surprisingly, that's the only game where it's played. And then I also recently played a game in the last year. This could be a very dangerous and challenging proposition for black's setup with b6. We will take a look at those games. Because of the danger inherent there, after queen c5, knight a3, knight f6, knight b5, I think black needs to also take a very, very close consideration of castles. Black then has two ways to sacrifice the exchange. This is probably one of the variations that you actually have to really know move by move for black. Moving on, after queen c5, knight a3, knight f6, again, there's bishop to e3. And here, we absolutely want to play queen c6, counterattack the pawn on e4. After queen c5, knight a3, knight f6, bishop d3, and there's also queen c5, knight a3, knight f6, e5, which is actually very, very important. Here, after knight g4, black threatens the pawn on e5, threatens queen takes f2 mate. Seems to be doing extremely well. However, white is allowed to move and plays the very powerful queen to d4. Black then has two ways to play. The knight on g4 is attacked, the queen on c5 of course is attacked. So there's d6. So there's some theoretical work to be done there, and it's not clear that d6 is sufficient for black. After queen c5, knight a3, knight f6, e5, knight g4, queen d4, there's also the endgame with queen takes d4, c takes d4. And in this critical position, where white has quite a bit of space, but is he overextended, we can quote sniper authority Charlie Story, the FM from England, on page 76 of his book, The Sniper. It seems like an equal ending to me, but there are still plenty of pieces and opportunities for both sides to try and win. Here we will examine critical endgame. In all cases, black did okay. However, it's not clear that his position was so good throughout. So we will need to take a close look at those. After queen c5, again, there's bishop d3. This non-threatening development, black has some leeway in move order as to how he wants to set up his pieces, but we'll look very closely at the game that starts with knight f6. Then there's also queen c5, bishop d3, and instead of knight f6, there's d6. That will be supplemented by some games in the notes. In either case, black seems okay. Both d6 and knight f6 against bishop d3, my preference probably is slightly for d6. Let's hold up this e-pawn if we can. All in all, d takes c5 is a very sharp, challenging way to meet black's sniper position. But again, with queen a5, c3, queen takes c5, if black is well prepared He's got a lot of resources. He does have an extra center pawn and good chances of setting up a very solid position and gradually outplaying white as the game progresses. The first game we will look at from the Dake C5 is Thorburn-Elvest versus GM Henley. This was played in Reykjavik, Iceland, 2004. After e4, c5, knight f3, g6. Now it's interesting that Elvest, super grandmaster from Estonia, starts out with the accelerated dragon move order, but then instead of exchanging on d4, he goes for bishop g7, putting pressure on the d4 pawn. And of course, this allows white the option of the Dake C5 continuation. So very interesting that Elvest would prefer to play the sniper than to capture on d4 as in a pure accelerated dragon. So queen a5 check, c3, queen takes c5, and now first we will look at bishop e3 since it is the most popular, as we said was played in over 300 games. Elvest plays queen a5. As we discussed in the introduction, we'll later look at queen c7 as well. But queen a5. Now bishop to d3. Theory considers that bishop c4 to be the most critical, and after knight c6, queen b3, threatening f7, e6, knight bd2, knight f6, bishop to b5, queen c7, bishop c5, preventing black from castling. Note that queen a3 also deserves consideration, but bishop c5, this is the game they quote, d6, bishop a3, and here, the first place I would look for improvement. In the game, black actually played bishop to d7. And of course, we're looking at the game Haslinger-Turner from England, 2007. Well, right here is the very first place that I would look at improvement. I would consider castles. And I guess the concern there is e5. This puts more pressure on the d6 square. But after knight takes e5, knight e5, d5, bishop f8, well, this is exactly the kind of dynamic exchange sacrifice that sniper players, look for. Lay awake nights dreaming about, I should hope. You have the bishop pair, you have this huge potential pawn mass. You're going to play b6 and a5, or simply b6 and bishop b7 and put your bishop on this long diagonal. This dark squared bishop is very good. You got a knight that can swing to d5 to f4. So again, instead of bishop d7, the first opportunity I would look to improve black's play would be the simple castles. Okay, but in the game, bishop d7 was played, and now rook to d1. The idea with rook d1 is that white wants to slam in with knight to c4, really overpowering the d6 point. After rook to d1, in the game, black played bishop f8, and after castles, white simply had convenient development, and black is behind the development, and it's not surprising that white won in 37 moves. So again, the next place that I would look for improvement here, after bishop d7, rook d1, is that I would look at, again, simply castling. After knight c4, it appears that white is overpowering the d6 point, and he is. So that's why we simply push d5, the very thematic, freeing shove, both in the Sicilian defense and in the sniper. And the point being that white has no time for bishop f8 because simply d takes c4 gains a valuable tempo, and then we collect the bishop on f8. After e takes d5, e takes d5, knight back to e3. Now again, it seems that black is getting overpowered here because the bishop on a3 is attacking the rook on f8. The knight, the rook, and the pawn are all attacking our poor little blockaded pawn. What to do? Well, first off, we don't panic. We play knight to a5, hit the queen, hit the bishop. After queen a4, we simply exchange off the light squared bishops. One problem solved. We've now gotten rid of our bad bishop. We give the queen a little love tap, and after queen c5, we simply exchange queens and play rook f to e8, pinning the knight. No problem. After castles, the simple counterattack with knight to c4 solves all of black's problems. hit the b pawn, hit the knight, and if he captures our pawn, we recoup the pawn on b2. Again, active sniper play, using tactics to solve the situation. So again, I would say bishop to c4 is highly overrated, and I suspect that Elvest was prepared.